So what contributes to this rise in drug resistance that we've seen? Well, these reasons can really be categorized into three main groups. The first is the use of drugs in hospitals. Hospitals generally have patients with weakened immune systems. This is because they're very old, very young, or they're already in the hospital because they're sick from something else. Also, surgeries happen in hospitals, and surgeries are intentional opening of the skin, a very important barrier at keeping microbes at bay. Now, this makes individuals in hospitals much more susceptible to infections and much greater in need of having additional assistance to help them fight the infection. Their normal immune system isn't strong enough typically to fight off that infection. And that's why many hospitals have to resort to treating their patients with antibiotics. However, this very responsible use of treating patients with antibiotics does make bacteria more resistant to the drugs. But there are irresponsible uses of antibiotics in hospitals, and this happens most notably when patients enter hospitals feeling sick and demanding antibiotics. Most of the time, when an individual feels sick, it is not because of bacteria, it's because of viruses. Viral infections cannot be treated by antibiotics. And so using antibiotics to treat viral infections not only will do absolutely nothing to help that patient, but it also increases the possibility of generating antibiotic resistant strains in the body. So that irresponsible use can absolutely be cut out if the patients can be diagnosed first, making sure that their infections are antibiotic susceptible bacteria. The second category of what makes this rise of antibiotic resistance increase so dramatically is using drugs or antibiotics in animal feed. In fact, roughly 70% of all the antibiotics used in the United States is used for industrial farming practices and not by hospitals or patients. That's because most ranchers in the US that have pigs, chickens, cows, sheep, and other farm animals will put antibiotics regularly into their animal feed instead of waiting for the animal to get sick. This would be like if you were to take an antibiotic pill every morning along with breakfast, sort of like a vitamin pill. Now, while this might sound ridiculous for you, this is what animals in the United States and many other areas of the world consume every day as part of their diet. This is because ranchers have found that if antibiotics are fed to their farm animals can generally maintain a healthier life. They can produce more meat and milk. And the farm ranchers don't have to worry about watching each individual farm animal to see if they're sick. It's the sheer quantity of all of the animals that are used in human food consumption in the US that makes this technique so common, because it's difficult for a farmer to identify which animal is sick if he or she has 1,000 or more animals to watch. However, because these antibiotics are being fed to farm animals on a regular basis, this means that there is constant pressure and natural selection occurring in those farm animals, continually selecting for bacteria resistant to that antibiotic. Now, of course, those antibiotic resistant bacteria can also infect the human population whenever there is butchering of the animal, or if the animal feces ends up on fruits or vegetables. So even if you're vegetarian, you can end up with antibiotic resistant strains in your body. We still are allowing the use of antibiotics in the US in farm animals today. The FDA and USDA are investigating the possibility of perhaps restricting this in the future. But for right now, the use of antibiotics in animal feed as a daily regimen for animals is completely legal, and ranchers do this all the time. Our third category of use of antibiotics that contributes to antibiotic resistance is worldwide drug resistance. Around the world, drug resistance is also showing up, and this is especially true in a lot of developing countries. The overuse and underuse of antibiotics in many of these areas of the world are contributing factors. So what do we mean by overuse? Well, if you've ever been to any other area of the world, you may find that in some countries, it's relatively easy to acquire medicine that is normally prescription medication. Prescription medication, including antibiotics, are often available just at a local convenience store or shop. And you can purchase them without doctor's consent or prescriptions. That means that many individuals are self-diagnosing, going to these convenience stores or shops and purchasing antibiotics, even when they may not be needing them. Then there's underuse of antibiotics as well. The underuse of antibiotics occurs when a parent is able to acquire a full dose of antibiotics for a single child who is sick. And if they then see one of their other children falling ill from the same disease, for financial reasons or because of availability of the antibiotic, they may end up sharing that single dose of antibiotic between two children. This type of underdosing allows just the weakest of the bacteria to die, keeping those bacteria that are slightly stronger alive. And this leads to antibiotic resistance development as well. Both of these factors are a result of not having enough healthcare and doctor availability in many parts of the world. If doctors were more available around the world, then we could require prescriptions from every patient before acquiring antibiotics, and we could prescribe antibiotics as much as they are needed, rather than having to share prescriptions. And with increasing globalization, the concerns of these far and remote countries is also a concern for you. Because of global travel, any antibiotic resistant strains that evolve and develop in these remote regions can easily end up in the US and even in your city. So how can we limit drug resistance development? Well, there's lots of different ways that scientists have hypothesized that could help mitigate or reduce the evolution of drug resistance. There's no way to completely eliminate it or to decrease the drug resistance that we already see, but we can limit its rise or slow its progression. And those three ways are: the first, drug use. So it would be ideal if physicians diagnosed every infection before prescribing antibiotics. You can diagnose these infections first, of course, by making sure that they are caused by bacteria. That would be nice. But the other thing that we can do is run one of these tests. These are referred to as antibiograms. And in this one particular, this is a Kirby-Bauer test. Antibiograms, like the Kirby-Bauer test, are a way to test for bacterial sensitivity to antibiotics. This is what we saw at the start of this lecture. You have a single bacterial species on a Petri plate, and you put a bunch of different antibiotics on there. The ones that have the biggest zone of clearing tell you that that antibiotic has the best ability to kill lots and lots of those bacteria. And that would be the antibiotic you would prescribe. Now, the reason why most doctors don't do this right now is because it takes some time. You have to take a swab of the patient, isolate and identify which of those bacteria from that swab are causing the disease, and then run this test, which takes at least a day. So doing the entire process could take a couple of days, and usually patients want to be in and out with a drug in hand as they leave the hospital. So this could end up not being successful for that reason. The second way that drug use can be improved to limit the rise of drug resistance is that patients must comply with and follow physicians' guidelines. Instead of sharing antibiotics, or in many cases, patients stopping the course of antibiotics because they're starting to feel better, patients need to finish the course of antibiotics if that's what the doctor tells them they need to do. I've heard many stories of individuals getting diarrhea or other side effects from antibiotics that are pretty common, and not liking those side effects. And so as soon as they start feeling better from the antibiotic, they stop taking the antibiotic. That is a surefire way of contributing to antibiotic resistant strains. Finally, another way that we can improve antibiotic resistance progression and slow it is by using what's referred to as combined therapy. Combined therapy is when patients use 2 or more antibiotics all at once. Now the reason is because the way evolution works is it works in steps. So the bacteria would evolve resistance to a single antibiotic one at a time. If you use 2 or more, it's almost impossible for the bacterial cell to evolve resistance to 2 things at once. However, most patients don't like doing this because it increases the risk of some side effects like allergies or diarrhea or other things. It's more drugs to take, and insurance companies don't like paying for 2 antibiotics when 1 will suffice. Secondly, a second major category of steps to limit drug resistance is drug research. Researching ways to develop shorter-term, higher-dose drugs. That way, if you don't have to worry about the patient taking the full course because it's short-term, maybe it's just a single pill and that's all you need, and that would be ideal. It would also be great to find new drugs or new types of drugs that won't result in resistance. There are efforts at doing this right now, but none of them have been successful. Finally, there are long-term strategies. This third category includes many small concepts. So long-term strategies include things like education of health workers and the public. That's one of the things that we're doing with this lecture. Taking especially valuable drugs that seem to be working really, really well and use them only in cases where they're absolutely required. Of course, a long-term strategy that would be amazing is to take out all antibiotics from animal feed. In the meantime, if you don't like consuming meat that has been fed antibiotics on a regular basis, you can choose to consume only meat that's been raised organically or grass-fed, grain-fed animals. Another long-term strategy is to increase government programs to low-income populations and provide them with more health care. And finally, one of my favorites is to use vaccines. And the reason why I like vaccines so much is because the concept behind vaccines, which we'll discuss later, is that vaccines protect you so you don't get sick ever. Antibiotics, of course, are only used when you're already sick, whereas vaccines is an injection and then you never get sick. Or if you get sick, it's very mild. So we have just a little bit more to chat about. We're going to take a closer look at some specific antibiotic resistant strains in the next section.